There are many factors that I would consider important when deciding whether or not a game is worth it. How enjoyable the gameplay loop is, the quality of its art and animation direction, the impact of the story, the diversity of the content, and the layer of polish that brings it all together. If a title hits the mark on most of the above, then you can expect the game to be a decent entry, whether it is a new game completely or a sequel. That being said, there is one additional factor that historically holds more weight, and that is the background of the content itself. This doesn't really apply to brand new games and stories, but rather long-term cult followings that have huge communities that love and adore all the different media, sources, and outlets that are offered for these particular universes. Some massive epics that come to mind are Star Wars, Elder Scrolls, Call of Duty, and Marvel. And while each of these studios and universes specialize in different areas like movies, shows, and gaming, they are all guaranteed to have a loyal fanbase that will consume their material no matter its quality. Long-term fan bases are a monolithic driving force, especially in the gaming community. I personally fall into a few of these communities, and while I may not purchase every game that comes along, I have a certain tolerance and bias towards these titles. That's what makes reviewing Lord of the Rings Gollum so much harder, because when asking the question of, is it worth it? I have to find a balance between my love of Tolkien and my love for quality gaming. I'll do my best to approach each with as much respect as possible and provide as much detail regarding the gameplay, art, story, content, and polish, as well as how well it fits into the Tolkienverse. I've decided to break down the game into 3 trains of thought, Clint Eastwood style. So without further ado, here is the good, the bad, and the ugly of Lord of the Rings Gollum. I'll start out by saying that I completed this game and I got the chance to experience all the highs and lows that it has to offer. I feel like every moment that I enjoyed was a genuine response to the game's mechanics and different situations that I experienced during my time controlling Smeagol and Gollum. The problem with these moments is that their often repetitive nature would be spoiled by a multitude of bugs and poor performance, which resulted in me constantly swapping between liking and not liking different aspects of the game. While this is the good section, I will do my best at highlighting all components of a particular subsection, listing off what worked great and what didn't work really at all. It didn't take me long to immerse myself into Middle-earth's beautiful landscape, even if we do start the game in Mordor. In fact, Lord of the Rings Gollum painted a whole new picture of Mordor and shed a vastly different perspective than what we saw with the Shadow of Mordor and War games. Perspective is the key word here. There were moments I truly felt like I was stepping into the shoes of the ring-corrupted hobbit as I was sneaking through the shadows and cracks of the giant mountains that make up Mordor. It's not that the Shadow of games misrepresent the area, but details are often missed when you are exploring the more open aspects of the world on 2 feet. The feeling of being forced to 4 feet allows for a unique approach to the land as well as some advantages over the other inhabitants, whether they are evil orcs or tasty critters. The contrast of feeling small like a bug is enhanced by the towering structures in the backdrop of the environment. I often found myself pausing on a cliffside to examine the land, and while I knew I wouldn't get the chance to explore those areas, it expanded the linear path that the game sets you on. In my opinion, one of the most impressive sights is early in the game. I don't want to get too specific for those that do end up playing through, but you get some additional insight into how Sauron likes to operate his prisons. It's such an impressive view, and is one that you'll consistently see throughout your first few hours of the game, and it was enough to keep me going through the walking simulator in those early chapters. While the art is fantastic, I do need to acknowledge the art direction for Smeagol and Gollum himself. His design was something that either fit the situation or felt completely out of place due to his facial expressions consistently swapping depending on if Gollum or Smeagol was the one talking. It had a somewhat unnatural feel that resulted in dialogue sections feeling uncomfortable. I found myself attempting to move the camera away from his face to avoid losing my immersion. That being said, his character model was designed quite well and was especially expressive when crawling through shadows and grass. While sneaking, Gollum and Smeagol would get down on their fingertips as low as possible in a spider pose, which they likely learned from their buddy Shelob. I would often walk around in this pose just to feel more like the slimy creature that Gollum is. What would a game about Gollum be without being able to sneak around your foes with the choice to quietly move past them or, as the game puts it, throttle them? The game allows you the option to unlife the orcs that cross your path, but I often chose the quiet and subtle route. To me, this would have been the way that Gollum navigated Mordor, only stopping to throttle a few necessary orcs. During your adventure, you will find yourself crawling through holes, climbing scaffolding, hiding in the shadows, and slowly moving through tall shrubbery to avoid the watchful eyes of the guards as you move forward with your quest. At its foundation, the stealth was designed very well, and did a good job of implementing that key word that I mentioned earlier: perspective. In most games with stealth options, you either feel like a cutthroat assassin destined to quickly eliminate targets, or a weak and frail traveler attempting to pass by with no one seeing. Lord of the Rings Gollum somehow successfully combines both of these roles into one, letting you choose your own path. Personally, I found these moments to be one of the key highlights in the game. In order to successfully make a game about Gollum, we needed to have experiences that made us feel like Gollum. In every adaptation, whether it be text or film-based, Gollum has always been portrayed as a creature that creeps through the dark and shadows. In this game, his impressive agility and strength in climbing allows for versatility in his maneuverability around the orcs and elves. With every encounter, you are normally greeted with a multitude of stealth methods for moving forward. As I mentioned, you can choose to move past or take a more heads-on approach, but if you get caught, you have to restart from the last checkpoint. You can normally pick from multiple paths to reach your objective, but there are often choke points that require Gollum to either crawl through a hole or climb up a particular tree. This linearity is okay, but is definitely an old school approach to level design. Disappointingly, this is where the good ends. I will make sure to acknowledge a few good aspects in the upcoming sections, but most of what I discuss moving forward will be areas that take away from the overall experience. This section, the bad, would better be described as the mediocre. But Clint Eastwood wasn't in a movie called The Good, the Mediocre, and the Ugly. The subcategories that I will be reviewing here are the level design and the decision-making mechanic, which both play a substantial role in the Lord of the Rings Gollum. And while they may succeed in delivering an enjoyable experience, they also fail to meet expectations and leave me wanting more out of the systems. The game is broken down into 10 acts that each have their own themes and goals to achieve. On top of this, Gollum mainly takes place in two separate areas that are the hubs for most of the acts. Normally, when you start a new act, you will begin in the hub area before receiving a task of some sorts that will send you off on a mini journey. There's usually some downtime where you get to interact and talk with the people and learn additional information about what is happening in that particular act. These sections are the most open areas of the game that give you the freedom to roam around and explore, to an extent. You're still locked into a closed arena, but it's reminiscent of old school style games that operate with a hub to level design. In fact, Lord of the Rings Gollum seems to heavily target our nostalgia for games that came out in the early to mid 2000s. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I wasn't expecting this when I started playing. My thoughts of a game as Gollum would have been more open by letting you decide your fate and movements, which would result in you leading your path more towards Gollum or Smeagol. Each act is extremely linear and focused on one objective. You will definitely find some deviations in the path for each level, but ultimately, you're trying to get from point A to point B. You won't find much freedom or creativity in the levels, and they feel like they were pulled straight out of the Hobbit game from 2003. Due to this, Lord of the Rings Gollum operates like a remastered game at best, as its design feels like it draws inspiration from old game design. It was refreshing and disappointing at the same time. I'm a huge fan of games from the GameCube era, but I feel like we have moved on from those styles of games as a whole. There's nothing wrong with creating linear, level-based games, but it depends on how the style is approached by developers. To me, one telltale sign is when a game attempts to deliver a linear game under the guise of an open-world experience. To me, this is a disappointing effect, as I'm expecting to explore the vast and expansive mountain ranges that I mentioned earlier, only to realize that they will only exist in the backdrop of my experience. If you group this with the fact that there is an additional emphasis put into the hub areas as explorable environments, then you are left with the world feeling empty rather than a detailed linear experience. All of this might be a personal pet peeve, but I prefer games being delivered as either open world or linear experiences. One of my favorite games also fits this mold of linear, open world, and happens to be a Lord of the Rings experience as well. It's called War in the North, which is a co-op, class-based, third-person hack-and-slash game that lets you level up as either a ranger, mage, or dwarf. One summer, my brother and I excessively played this game. To say we were obsessed would be an understatement. War in the North had multiple locations that you could explore and fight through, which acted as levels in the game. However, when examining the map, there were tons of nodes that had descriptions, leading us to believe that they were locked areas. But when we beat the game, they remained locked. We realized that they were there to establish the lore of the world and nothing else. It was honestly one of the most disappointing gaming moments of my life, as I was ready to dedicate my entire summer to this game with my brother. War in the North had redeemable gameplay and combat, so it still ended up being a game that we heavily enjoyed, but its scope suffocated under its false pretense of being a larger world. Lord of the Rings Gollum did the same thing, but it didn't have the luxury of having polished aspects in other areas of the game. I wish that I could put the decision-making feature into the good section, because in my opinion, it's the feature that makes Lord of the Rings Gollum the most unique. Throughout the game, you will be required to make choices that alter the outcome of your interactions. You'll have to choose to side with either Smeagol or Gollum about a particular argument, which activates a sequence of events in which you'll have to convince your counterpart to follow through with your plan. I use one example in particular that happens at the very beginning of the game. There's a beetle flying around that Smeagol wants to play with, but Gollum thinks it's a spy. They'll argue about letting it fly or squashing it. I decided to side with Smeagol because I see the good in him. In debate team fashion, Gollum began listing points as to why leaving the beetle alive is dangerous and we should squash it so we don't get caught. I selected from a few options to rebuttal his concerns, and ultimately I was able to convince Gollum that the beetle wasn't a spy, which ended me up in jail. But I think it would have happened regardless. I found myself defending Smeagol in every debate for the first part of the game as I was a believer in his hobbit heart, but I think this made my experience worse. In my eyes, I didn't want to side with any choices that I wouldn't make myself, which normally aligned with Smeagol's kinder heart. However, I soon found this to be an unrealistic approach to each situation as I acknowledged the constant battle between Smeagol and Gollum. I started evaluating each situation from both Smeagol and Gollum's eyes to determine which counterpart would have likely had ownership at that particular time. For those of you that end up playing this game, I would suggest that you do this as well. I found that balancing the choices between Smeagol and Gollum led to a better experience, as it created more conflict and variety in the game. My main complaint about this feature that lands it in the bad section is the lack of choices that we get to make. I understand that each choice should be unique and have its purpose, but I wish the game would have created more opportunities for us. As I mentioned earlier, I personally think that this feature is what made the game unique and worthwhile, but the interactions were so far and few between. I understand that oversaturating the feature would remove the enjoyment factor overall, but I wish there would have been a few more choices to be made. We've reached the hardest section. As a Lord of the Rings fan, I was disappointed in the experience that we were delivered, and it saddens me to have to write about these next few negative components. The story, overall gameplay mechanics, and performance had little to no redeemable aspects and ultimately heavily reduced the quality of the product. These three areas have very little positives to explore, but I will do my best to pinpoint what I enjoyed. First and foremost, I was skeptical about a game following Smeagol and Gollum. There's so much text and information surrounding this character already, I was concerned about how comprehensive and detailed the story would be. Not only that, but every adaptation displays Smeagol and Gollum as a slimy creature, and even though we see moments where Smeagol is able to break free from Gollum's suffocating grasp, this game goes a step beyond what should be acceptable. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for bringing characters into the light and providing them with a redemption arc, but doing it for Gollum in between the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings timeline just doesn't make sense. My main issue with the game is how quickly it changes. There will be some moments where everything is going good and Gollum for some reason has friends, and then in the blink of an eye, everyone is just being a jerk to each other. Alternatively, Gollum will be attempting to escape and end up getting caught, resulting in his captors throwing him into a jail cell. Actually, no, they don't. They slap us on our wrists and say, "Don't do that again, Gollum." We roll our eyes and crawl back into the hole that we used to escape in the first place. The entire structure of how Smeagol and Gollum interact with the people around them is blatantly bad and unrealistic. At some points, characters will be treating Gollum with actual respect just to in turn treat him like a slug. Gollum will say to an elf, "You look tasty, precious, we hates you." And the elf will respond, "Haha, good old Gollum cracking jokes." Then, you'll be roaming around the hub area and they'll say, "I don't understand why they let you out of your cell, slime. It just doesn't make sense." As bad as it sounds, they painted Smeagol and Gollum in too much light. A game that highlights Gollum should specifically cover the conflicts, struggles, and complications that they experience due to the overwhelming corruption and draw caused by the One Ring. While we do get an inside look into some of this conflict, it is paired directly with soft and calming moments, which I personally don't believe Smeagol and Gollum would have experienced at the time. In my opinion, the game should have heavily focused on survival and hiding in an open world experience that limited interactions with other characters, while putting more attention towards Smeagol and Gollum's external conversations with each other. In Lord of the Rings Gollum, the gameplay can be split into three main categories: stealth, climbing, and everything else. Climbing will be done at any stage during the game, and stealth is the main focus when sneaking to your objectives. However, the rest of the game doesn't really fall into any specific category. It is essentially just a walking simulator. On various occasions, you walk from one place to the next with elves, prisoners, and a variety of other characters and just listen to them talk about the same things. I understand that the intent is to add some depth to the individuals that Smeagol and Gollum are interacting with, but as I pointed out earlier, Gollum's position on the social leaderboard shouldn't be the focus of the game. There is a level of manipulation that comes with learning the inner thoughts of those around you, but in the end, it goes far beyond being just a tactic. These sections make up a large majority of the game. Unfortunately, they were just boring. Poor game optimization seems to be a common trend as of late, and Lord of the Rings Gollum is one of the worst cases I've seen. I don't have the most overpowered rig, but I am running an RTX 3070 Ti and a Ryzen 7 5800X, which puts me well above the recommended specs for the game. I will note, upon receiving the game, I was notified that I should turn off Gollum's hair animation, as if it was left on, it would cause performance issues. I can confidently say that all the performance issues that I saw were with this feature turned off, which makes me concerned for the state of the game for those that left Gollum's hair flowing free. This game had extreme moments of stuttering and graphical complications that made moments unplayable. Act 9 in particular had some of the worst FPS fluctuations, ranging from 5 to 15. There were times that I would stop playing completely due to how much my FPS would drop. On top of overall performance, the game came with its fair share of bugs. One bug in particular almost locked me out of completing the game entirely, but I was luckily able to move past the section due to some clever save and load manipulation. There were times that Gollum would phase through objects completely, or other times where his animations would be completely broken. I normally find bugs to be enjoyable, as they often give me a good laugh, but the only times I found myself laughing during Lord of the Rings Gollum was out of shock about the overall poor state of the game. I completed Lord of the Rings Gollum, and I learned about his time in between The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, albeit not a canon representation. These are factual statements that I can make about the game. The rest of it is up for your own interpretation. If you're wondering if there are any enjoyable moments in the game, then I can say yes. I thoroughly enjoyed stealthily maneuvering past my enemies in the beautifully set environments. The decision-making feature was cool and added some additional insight into the conflict between Smeagol and Gollum. If you were wondering if the game was bad, let me just say there were moments that I wanted to put the game down and not pick it back up. However, my love for Lord of the Rings required me to finish the game. Unfortunately, the game's finale did not make me feel any better about my choice to continue through to the bitter end. I can't say whether a game is worth it or not, but I can say that Lord of the Rings Gollum doesn't meet the expectations that come with being a part of the Tolkienverse. Thanks for watching. If you do decide to pick up the game, let me know your thoughts below. And if you enjoy the video, make sure that you like and subscribe.